Welcome to Adobe Campaign Training and this session on validation and service calls for forms. After completing this training, you should be able to configure form fields with advanced operations, validate field data from a form, and understand how service calls work from within forms. This will allow you to take greater control over your form fields and add customized operations to your form data. As we know, in Adobe Campaign, each schema defines a data type. The schema is then implemented in the physical structure of the database. When we want to manipulate data that is saved in the database based on that schema, we can generate a form, and the form allows us to have a visual representation of the data where a marketer or operator can easily work with it. Now, once we have the attributes and elements of the schema and we add them to the form, this is how we display the data in a physical way to the operator. Sometimes data in the schema we want to have displayed, but we don't want the operator to be able to manipulate it. So for example, an account number or a primary key or a SKU for a product, for example, a stock keeping unit, those kinds of fields where we may be interested in displaying the data to the operator but not allowing them to manipulate it, these fields can be made read-only. That means it will be displayed in the form, but the operator has no way to change it, delete it, or edit it. We can also add to a data element or attribute that's being displayed in the form, we can add the required field. And what that means is that when the operator is creating a new record, for example, and they're filling in the data, and let's say, for example, they're creating a new recipient record, when they're creating that record and they go to save the form, the saving of the form adds the row into the database table that holds that recipient's data. Now, if when we're saving that data, we want to require that certain data be included in the form before it can be saved, we can make that a required field. The syntax of the example that we see below works like this. I have in an input field the XPath value email, and the attribute field is required gets true. So what that means is there's now a field on the form where the operator can enter the person's email. This field is required. Now, as we've seen in previous lessons, we have the leave option for this input field. When the operator goes to save this form, it will examine each field that has one of these leave tags, and it will do a check. In this case, the check is looking and seeing, is the email field the empty string? And if it's empty, then it will pop up an error and say email address is required. Right? So this means that the person, the operator, is not going to be able to save the new recipient record until they've entered an email. Remember from earlier lessons, we also have the option of using a data policy of email on that string field. So we can not only check to see whether the field is empty, we can also make sure that when the text is entered into the email field, that it meets our policy requirements for the pattern of the string as well. Now that's a simple validation of a form where I'm looking at the length of the text. Is it an empty string? And we've seen from data policy we can look at the formatting of the string. But there may be data that I'm entering into the form that I need to validate through some other more complex means. And one of the options to do this is that I can make a SOAP call from the form. So for example, inside those leave tags that we saw earlier, we can make a SOAP call where it goes out and checks the value using some other application, using some web service call to another database, or checking anything really that we need to do. So in addition to the standard checking and the leave tags that we've seen before, we may also validate using a JavaScript SOAP call. SOAP calls can be used to validate form data from the console. And before we can add this SOAP call to the form, of course, we have to define the SOAP call itself. So in this case, in the NMS namespace, we have the recipient data type. And for that data type, we've added a method definition called checkValue. And of course, the actual code for that looks like this, and this would be saved in a JavaScript file. So the definition is in the schema, but the schema itself would point to this JavaScript file where it would have this kind of function. And of course, this is just a signature, basically, an example of how that function would work. So when this function executes, and by the way, it will look NMS is the namespace, underscore recipient, and then recipient is the data type, and then underscore is the method definition itself. So in this case, it's check value. And you see it's passing in a value from the form as well. This function will write an entry into the log checking value, and then will display the value that's being passed in. It does an if statement to look for a particular value. If the if statement is false, then it will log an error into the log. If it's true, then we'll return 1. The return value can be used also to modify the form. Now, if we want to validate form data using a SOAP call, we modify the form to add the SOAP call element into the leave element. So if you look down below, we're inside the form, and the name of the form is recipient. We've got the leave call on a particular field, and then we've got the opening tag of the SOAP call, and then the closing tag. The SOAP call, you see that the service is the namespace and the data type, in this case NMS recipient, and then the name is the function value, check value, and the function name check value, and that's what we saw on the previous slide. So you must have the name of the method that's being called exactly right. The capitalization must match perfectly to what's defined in the JavaScript and in the schema method definition, or this is not going to work. Any exception will be displayed to the user and prevent saving of the form if this SOAP call returns false. The service is the schema name in the namespace, and this call is also performed synchronously. Of course, it has to be made immediately because you're trying to save the form. Now, in addition to using SOAP calls from a form to validate data, we can make SOAP calls from a form to do other things as well. So in this case, we've got the enter of a particular field. The SOAP call is going to a service, and that's the namespace and the data type. So the namespace is C4 and the data type is YB client. It's calling a function called client. We see the input is the expression @ID. Now this is actually taking the data from the form context. So once you write the data into the form, and the ID for a recipient, for example, is the primary key. For YB client, it's whatever is defined as the key. And so that's what it's taking as the input, and we see that that type is a string in this case. The output parameter is xPathOut, and it would be read in the form as /temp /@count. And so I can use that value inside the form. So in this training, we've learned how to do the following: how to configure form fields with advanced operations, how to use a SOAP call to validate the field data that's entered into a form, and we've also seen how to more generically simply make web service calls from within a form.